I'm going to show you how to make a time trial today. We have this point on the ground where if we overlap, we start the trial. Points appear throughout the level, and a timer starts ticking on screen. If the timer reaches 0 before we grab all the points, the trial ends in failure. And if we overlap with the start point again while the trial is running, we cancel the trial entirely. When the player overlaps with each point, they disappear, and we collect a point value from each point until we reach the total points required to finish the trial. If we collect all the points before the trial is done, we win. We also have the option to count up and set a designated goal to something that isn't 0 if you would rather use this tutorial to set up a speedrun instead. So, let's get into it. Starting off with a new third-person template, I've imported the FX Variety Pack, which you can get off of Fab for free. We'll be using this as our cascade effects for our actors. What we want to do is open up our blueprints. And we're going to create 2 actors. One actor is going to be our trial start actor, and the next is going to be our points actor. So right-click, add a blueprint type actor. We'll call this one BP_trial start. And the next one, BP_trial point. So we'll open up the trial start actor first, and we want to add a box collision. And we're going to want to add a cascade particle system component. Then we're going to open up the trial point, and we're going to do the same thing. For our particle system component, I'm going to get the P_KY_waterball. And for our trial start actor, P_KY_magic circle 1. You could set it to be whatever you like, but these are what I'm going to be using. So we can drag these 2 anywhere into our level. Okay, so now the idea is that if we overlap with our sigil on the ground, we'll start our time trial. We'll spawn these 2 spheres. When we overlap with them, the spheres will disappear. And if we collect all of them before the timer runs out, we win the time trial. So we can start off with our trial start actor and go to the event graph. So what we'll do is on begin play, we're going to take our particle system and we are going to deactivate it. That way, when the level starts, we can't see this. Then we're going to click on the box, and all the way on the bottom right on our component begin overlap, we can copy our particle system, and we can also say deactivate, because by the time that we overlap with this, we'll be able to see it. So when we overlap with it, we want to deactivate it again. Now, in our trial start actor, on begin play, we are going to get all actors of class to get an array of every trial point we have in our level. And we could say BP_trial points. Promote that to a variable. I'm going to rename it trial points. And with our box collision, again, go to our begin overlap. And we're going to get a for loop. So when we overlap, we're going to take each actor in our trial points. Then we are going to get the particle system. and we are going to set it as active. I'm going to switch this to the new editor window. So now we can see that they spawn, and when we overlap, they deactivate. So now we need to know that we've collected every point actor that we can end the trial. The way that we're going to do that is by incorporating a point system. And the reason being is because maybe we want to have points do different things. Maybe we want to have blue points be 1 point, or if the color is green, it's worth 3 points, and if it's red, we can subtract a point, and the player will need to get a certain amount of points to be able to win the game before the trial is over. To deal with that, we're going to be making use of a blueprint interface. Now, if you don't know what a blueprint interface is, it is a separate file. So you can go to the content drawer and type in blueprint, or type in interface, blueprint interface, and we'll name it BPI_time trial. And in here, we can set a list of functions to be able to use, and every blueprint that incorporates this interface has access to these functions and can set that information to each other without having to cast. So we'll need to get a function to start our trial. So we'll get time trial start. Maybe another function to add up our count. So time trial count. Another one to reset our actors. Time trial reset. And since we have a start, we can have an end. So time trial end. Now, with our time trial start, we want to have the actor that initiated our time trial. So we'll go to inputs, trial start actor. We'll get type actor and make sure that it's the object reference. For our time trial count, we'll just need to get an integer for our points. For our reset, we shouldn't need anything. And for our end, we need to know if the trial ended and we won, or if we didn't win. So we'll just call it 1 and set it as Boolean. We can compile it and save it. Now, if we go to our trial start actor and we go to our class settings, and at the bottom here, implement interfaces, we can search for BPI and we'll come up with the time trial. Now that we added it in our interfaces, you'll see every function listed here. We're going to do the same thing with our trial point. Class settings, add interface, time trial, and we're going to open up our character sheet, BP_third person character. And we are going to do the same thing here. So the idea is that when we start this, we're going to define the total number of points that we need in order to have the player win the game. So we're going to add a variable, and we're going to call it total points. And we're going to have that be of type integer. And we're going to get another integer, and we're just going to call it points, or you can call it current points or cumulative points, however you'd like. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to say that the total points are going to be equal to the number of points we have in our array. So we can drag off the array, get length, and connect it. So since we only have 2 points, our total points are going to be equal to 2. And when we overlap with our box, since this is starting, if we overlap it again, we don't want to keep feeding information into this. So we're going to get a branch. And we're going to promote this condition to a variable. And we're going to rename the condition running. So by the time we reach this, if we're not running, we're going to set this to running. And then we're going to set the points. Then if we overlap this again, we're going to put our branch for true to be to end our timer when we get to that. So then our player can stop the time trial at any point by overlapping the actor again. And then if we start the trial, maybe we just play a 2D sound. And we'll just say click on button. Switch back to our trial point. And we're going to say that if this is overlapped in addition to it being deactivated, we are going to call time trial count. And make sure you choose the one that has message next to it. And this is why we are using interfaces. When we overlap with this, we have to point a target. Since we're overlapping it with our character, we're going to be plugging in the target for our third-person character. So now this calls the information. We can put 1 point in here because we want all of our trial points to count as 1 point. And then we need to open up our third-person character. In our third-person character, we can call time trial count. And now, since we passed this information to our third-person character, we need a way to pass it back to our trial start actor. And our trial start actor, what we can do is right before we get our loop, we want to have this other actor point to our third-person character as well. So we can get our time trial start. And again, make sure that it is the message. So now when we overlap, we can send the trial start information to our third-person character. We can just drag off this and type in self to get a reference to self. And in our third-person character, we can double-click on the time trial start. And we're just going to save a reference here to our trial start actor. Because now when we have this, we can get our trial start actor. Then we'll get our time trial count again. Make sure that it's the message. And the points that were passed here from our trial point is going to be passed to our trial start actor. To get a gist of what we're working with, we go to our time trial start. And every time we receive something from our time trial account, we will just print hello. So when we overlap with each of these points, you'll see that it says hello up on the top. And if we're running through them, it's still saying hello because even though it is deactivated, we're still overlapping with the box. And we'll fix that in a second. The way we're designing this is accumulating points on overlap, but if you wanted to have something like break the targets from Smash, or you want to have a trial to defeat a number of enemies in a time limit, you can, so long as you get the points from those actors to the trial start blueprint. So we'll delete that string. And then if we take our points, we will set our points equal to the points that we received plus the points that we already had. Then we'll get a branch. And then we will see if the total points that we have are equal to the points total for our time trial. If that is the case, then we want to end the trial and designate it as a win. And we'll just make a variable here. Now we'll just call it win as a Boolean. And then when we do win, we want to reset our time trials. We're going to create a custom event. We're just going to call it end trial. And we're going to take our points and set them back to 0. We're going to take our running, check it to be false. We'll be adding a bit more to this later. But if we do win, we're going to play a 2D sound again. And we'll just say compile success. Okay. Now with our trial points, then we don't overlap with them twice. How we can manage this is by getting a branch, dragging in the particle system, and then checking is active. And if it is active, we will deactivate it and then count it. Now, I've had some issues with Niagara and the particle system using more complex meshes. Sometimes when you do overlap, if you have multiple meshes, it may overlap simultaneously. And even though we overlap with this, it'll still trigger twice and add multiple points instead of just one. If that's the case, I've had better luck hiding the actor and setting it to be branched off of whether or not the actor is hitting. So now, if we wander through these points, we're not accumulating any points, even though that actor is still there. So before we move on to the next steps, we need to actually incorporate a timer. So we're going to open up the content drawer, and we are going to add a widget blueprint. And we're going to call this W_timer. And all of our functions of our widget is going to be put in the timer, and that's going to be displayed in text on our character's screen. If you don't already have another widget for your heads-up display, we'll do the same, just creating a new one, and we'll call it W_HUD. And open up the HUD, and we're just going to add a canvas. And then we are going to get W_timer, drag it in, and we're going to go to anchors and just select it to be the top middle. Position it how you'd like. And then we can close down the HUD. Open up our W timer. And we're going to be needing to make a few functions, so we can go over to the graph and start adding our functions. The first function we're going to be making is our start timer. And we're going to add one input, which is a Boolean. And it's going to be count up. This way we can toggle whether or not we want to have our timer count down to 0 or count up to whatever you want to set the goal to be. We're going to promote this to a variable. Then we are going to set timer by function name. Promote the return value to a variable. And we'll name it trial timer. And we are only going to be calling this if our timer is currently valid. Before we continue with that, we will need to clear our timer. So we're going to add another function. And just call it clear timer. And we're just going to get our trial timer and then clear and invalidate timer by handle. We go back to our start timer. And we're going to call clear timer if our timer is true. Then we're going to run our timer, and then false, we could just run the timer. As for the function name, we're going to make a function called update timer. We could just copy that, create a new function with the same exact name. And how we'll handle this is that we need to make a new time span. So click on the variables, and we can just call it time. And get it of type time span. And we're going to take our time, and then we are also going to make a time span. And we are going to add these two together. Then we need to set the time, and that's going to be another function. So we can set time. And our time is going to have 3 inputs. Our first is minutes. Second is seconds. And we can count to milliseconds. All of type integer. And after we're done with the update timer, we'll come back to this. So we want to call set time. And we can break this time span. And plug in our minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Then we can go back to our set time now. And we're going to be setting the time variable. We can make time span. And the information that's passed here into our minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Then we can break the time span. And then we want to take this integer and convert it to a text. So we can get to text. And we can duplicate that twice for our seconds and our milliseconds. Now, milliseconds, we're going to restrict to 2 minimum and 2 maximum for our integral digits. And then after that, we can format text. And to do this, we need to type in the variables that we want into the format. So we'll get open curly brace, minute, closing curly brace, colon, and repeat the same step for our seconds and milliseconds. And so now we can set the text in a counter that we can add to our widget. So we're going to go back to our designer. And now we are going to add a text block here. Then we can rename this from text block, whatever it is, to timer counter. And we want to select that as a variable. And when we go back to our graph, you'll see that we have timer counter here now. We'll drag in our timer counter, and we want to set text. So now whatever information is in our time variable gets converted to a formatted text block that is going to be displayed in our timer counter. And the last function we need is a goal for ourselves. So we're going to make a new function, and we're going to say set goal. And this is also going to have 3 inputs of type integer, of minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Then we're going to make a new time span. And this is going to be called time goal. Make a time span, connect the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Now for updating our timer, it's a bit of a design choice here. If you just wanted to have seconds, if our start timer could just be set to 1, you can go into the update timer, and normally we could just have our timer count 1 second, and then we add 1 second, but we want to be able to show milliseconds, so we're going to have to adjust our timer. The problem with that is that if we start adding milliseconds on our timer, it doesn't necessarily overflow into our seconds, so we need a way to add milliseconds and seconds, and have all this spill over to minutes if we wanted to count up, or otherwise go down from minutes to seconds to milliseconds in a fashion that looks pleasing to the player. Every tick, you can just get a variable. We'll call it cumulative time of type integer. We can set our cumulative time equal to our current cumulative time plus 1. And then take our cumulative time. And because we want to know if we're counting up or down, we'll have to drag in our count up. We will select integer, or select int. And if we are counting up, A will be 1. And if it's B, we'll be doing -1. Then we can add the cumulative time to our integer. Our cumulative time is either going to tick up or it's going to tick down, and plug it into seconds. This can also be simplified by just taking our cumulative time and putting it there. That way every tick will be either adding 1 or removing 1. We will revisit this to set milliseconds, so then it looks like an actual timer. But for now, we're going to go back to our trial start actor and start incorporating this into our time trial. So we're going to go to the right of all this, and we're going to create a custom event. And we're going to call this time trial HUD. And because we don't have a widget in our third-person character, we can just add it here. So we're going to create widget. And we're going to get our HUD. And we can get player controller. And plug that in as the owning player. Then we're going to promote this to a variable, and we're going to call it HUD. And then we're going to add it to the viewport. Now, if you already have a HUD in your third-person character, you can either cast this to your third-person character to set the timer portion to be visible or hidden, or you can make another Blueprint interface function to call that in your third-person character. But for our timer, we're going to drag in our HUD. We are going to get W_timer. And we're going to get a sequence node to make this a bit tidier. The first thing we want to do is set the visibility of our timer. Connect that here. And by default, we do want this timer to not be present. fact, if we open up our HUD again, we actually want to go to the graph and on our pre-event construct, get our timer and set visibility to hidden. Then we're going to set a timer by event. And the time for our trial is going to be equal to whatever we want to have for our time trial. If we want to set it to be 60 seconds, 5 minutes, whatever, that's going to be the time for our trial. So we're going to make a new variable here and we're going to call it trial time. And this is going to be the time span. We'll drag that in and we are going to break the time span. Since these are all integers, if we have our minutes, we want to multiply this by 60. Otherwise, we can leave our seconds the same. You don't need to worry about milliseconds since we're not really going to be doing anything with them. They're not going to be that explicit in our timer, but whatever you set to have as our timer update time, the milliseconds are going to have to be equal to that. So if we run this every 0.01 seconds, you'd have to divide the milliseconds by 0.01, for example. So we can add our minutes and seconds and plug that into our time. We are going to create a custom event again. And we're going to call this reset timer. Drag off of our event and we can create event and call our reset timer that we just made. We'll also want to promote this return value so then we can cancel this timer when it's done. And we'll just name this reset. Dragging off W timer, we're going to start timer. Then we're going to set the time. And then we want to set the goal. For our purposes here, we're only going to be counting down. Our set time is going to be equal to our trial time, so we can connect the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds here. And the goal we're going to leave is all 0, so we're going to be counting down to 0, and when it's done, we are going to be finished. So with our reset timer, when this does reset, we are going to set the visibility again. And we're going to hide our timer. We are going to say that we are no longer running the trial. We can go back to our end trial and reassess this now, since if we call reset timer, we can do this as well. So we're just going to take apart our end trial. And when we reset the timer, we're going to reset the trial. But what we're going to do with our end trial is we are going to add a Boolean here, and we're going to call this win. And we had made a time trial end function that's going to do basically the same thing, but since we don't call it anywhere else, since we're handling anything in the time trial start, we could just remake this here. So I'm going to not use the blueprint interface, and we're just going to get our time trial. However, you can still use the end time trial, calling it from any other actor if you want to use that instead. One example would be if you wanted to have the trial done without the character making damage. If they did take damage, you can immediately call an end to the time trial. Same thing as if the player goes out of bounds or dies normally. So we'll call an end trial here. And then whether or not we win, we'll set this depending on the conditions. And after we reset, we want to drag off of our widget and we want to clear our timer. And then we want to also remove the widget from our viewport. So we can get our widget or our HUD, and we can remove from parent. And as I said before, if you're handling this in your own character and you already have a HUD, you might not need to do this. So now we want to set the trial time, and we're going to do that when we start playing the game. So when we get our actors of class and we set them all to be active, when that is all done, we are going to get our trial time and set it here. We're going to make a time span. And you can promote each one of these to variables, make them instance editable, so then if you have multiple trial start actors in your level or in your game, you can set it dynamically rather than opening up the blueprint and changing them here. But we're just going to set this to be 5 seconds. And for us to count with our timer, I'm going to set that back to 1 second. And then we want to go to our trial start. And then when we overlap with this, at the end of our 2D sound, we want to call our time trial HUD. A few things to adjust. Okay, and that is because if we go back to our set timer, set time, we could change all of these minimum and maximum to 2. That way it's always going to display 2 digits. So we will go to our update timer. See how this works by plugging in the select in and plugging it directly into milliseconds. In our start timer, we're going to have this be 0.01, and we have to check looping. Let's see how this works. So you can see the milliseconds are counting, and every 10 seconds it's going to spill over because we're counting at 0.01 instead of 0.0001, but I think that the milliseconds tick way too fast for that. So what we want to do is keep it like this for our milliseconds, but then we need to calculate our seconds. So the way that we're going to calculate the seconds is that we're going to copy our cumulative time. And whether or not we're counting up or down should not matter, so we're going to get the absolute value. And then we are going to get the division, whole and remainder node. And we will divide this, our total number. And because we're counting 10 milliseconds at a time, our divisor is going to be 100. So if we are able to divide by 100, it means that we've count up to our timer. So now we can see if this is equal to 0, meaning that there's no remainder, we're going to get another select int. We're either going to add 1 second or we're going to add nothing at all. And we're going to multiply this by our other select int because we need to know if it's going to be a positive or negative number. And that will be our seconds. So now you can see it is counting down, and we've reached 5 seconds and the timer ends and we're done. We'll have to come back to this in just a second, because what happens though, if we do it like this, is if we had, say, we'll put 15 seconds on the clock and run it. And we can have this run and it looks like it's running normally. However, if we go 10 seconds, you'll see that when we get down to 15, it ticks past 4 and goes directly to 3 because it's spilling over the number of milliseconds over to seconds. To do that, we'll use the return value. And we want to check if our return value is divisible by 10. So we'll get the modulo. And put in 10. So we want to get a not equals or a 0, and we want to combine this with an andable. So a bit more of an explanation. If we had 21 seconds, we divide this by 100, so we know that this would be 21 seconds. However, because we're also still counting the milliseconds, every 10 seconds it's going to spill over. So at 10 and at 20, when we don't have any remainder, that's when we pick 0. So then our milliseconds spill over to the seconds and we don't count that second. Now if we start it and we look at our timer and we very patiently wait for 15 seconds on the clock, not even, because once we get down to 5, you'll see that it ticks down to 4, which it was skipping before. Okay, and if you want to make sure that this is accurate back in our trial start, you can set another timer and you can get a custom event off of it. Just call it test, and you can manually put in the time that you want. Then after that 15 seconds, you can print hello. That way, you'll know that your timer is displaying correctly against a timer that, well, is much more simple to set. Just disconnect that, but good to know for now. So now, there's 2 more things that we want to do. We go back up to our overlap box with our branch being true. If we overlap again with this running, we want to end the trial. And everything is ended when we hit this reset timer. But with our end trial here, what we're going to say is, first of all, we're going to get a for each loop. Then we're going to get our trial points. And what we're going to do is that when we call end trial, we're going to loop through all of our trial points, and we are going to set them to be hidden. And because we made a blueprint interface here, we can either do the same thing that we did before, where we get the particle system. And then set this to be hidden, or deactivate it. Or we can make use of our time trial reset. So cancel that. And we might want to take off the context so then we can get the message here and point that to each object. If we go back to our trial points and we click on time trial reset, essentially what we can do is drag in the particle system, and deactivate it. Either way works. You may want to call this at more than one time depending on how you want to scale your own project. That's why it's good to have it as its own interface. So we'll make some use out of that. Then when we are completed, we're going to get a branch. And depending on whether or not we've won, we're going to play a sound. And we're going to get a small delay since we have sound being played off of our trial points actor when we overlap with this. So we want to give it a little bit of time to finish up. We'll play 2D sound. And we'll duplicate it to the bottom there. If we've won, we're going to play compile success. And if we fail, we're going to play compile failed. And now we're going to go back to our time trial count. We can remove our trial success. We're still going to keep win. So we're going to flag win as true or false, depending on how we end the game. So when we have win, we can call a reset timer. And since we flagged this as win before we do the reset, when the reset is called, win will be true. It'll go to our end trial. It'll play the victory sound. And after we call reset timer, we're going to want to clear and invalidate our reset. Didn't realize I had that typo. And we're going to do the same thing here. And we're going to, when it's running, we're going to set win as false. And then we are going to call reset timer. And at the end of reset timer, if it is called before this is cleared and invalidated, right at the end we can clear and invalidate timer by handle. And it should work. We need to spell this correctly. And then we can drag in win and set it to be false no matter which way we finish. So if we overlap and then we overlap again, we end the trial. And we overlap one more time, we start it. We are overlapping with both of these and we got a success. You want to make sure that you hit all of them. So then your points are actually cleared. Take one, reset, start again, take another one, and then we're going to wait for the timer to end. And hopefully we did everything right. We should see failure. So one last thing that we need to do. If you notice, we don't have anything that this set goal does. Our timer naturally counts down to 0 after we set in the trial time, so if we do want to count up, this isn't going to do anything. So, to make sure that this actually works, we're going to take this bit and replicate it in the set goal, and then we're going to make an output to plug into our timer. So we can go to set goal, and we want to add our time span that we set. So we're going to say start time of time span. And our output is going to be a float value that is going to be our time for the timer. So our start time, we're going to break the time span. And we're going to do the same thing for our time goal. I suppose if you don't use time goal for anything else, you could just connect it to the inputs for the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. But we're going to take our minutes and subtract. And we're going to do the same thing for seconds. And you can do the same thing with milliseconds. But like I said, if you don't incorporate those, there's no real need to do it. So we're going to multiply the minutes by 60. Then we're going to add them to the seconds that we have. And then if our time goal is higher than our start time, and then we flip it, it could be the case that some of these values are negative, so we're going to get the absolute value. And then we're going to connect that as a float to our time. And then if we go back to our trial start actor, I'm going to disconnect the pin off of our set visibility, move our test over, and we can get rid of these 3 nodes and connect our timer in. If you leave this connected up to the first pin, it could hit the timer before we actually set the time. So if we have our trial start be set to 0, and we'll just have a goal set to 5 seconds, and we make sure that count up is checked. And if we count down, it counts down -5 seconds. Keep in mind that even though we had the absolute value of our timer, that's only so then the time is not negative. You'll still have to set it correctly for the text to display in positive numbers. Since I went sequentially making this, if we want to revisit our set time and remove our time span, and we remove the variables for our integers, we can just create a new time span variable and call that time, and plug it directly into our time variable here. And when we go back to the start, if we disconnect all of our pins, we could just connect the trial time. We can connect our start time. And then we'll have to go back to our W timer widget and do the same thing. Now, I know we've done a lot, so we're just going to recap everything before the end of the video. In our trial start actor at begin play, we get an array of all the trial points that will be in our time trial. When we overlap with the trial start actor, we call this time trial start and send it to our player. In the third person character, we have a hard reference to our start trial actor to use for later. Then we loop through all the trial points and we set them to be visible. After it's all visible, we define the time span of how long we want this trial to last, or rather the start time, which in this example is 10 seconds. If we're not running the time trial, we set it to be running, and we flag the total points as equal to the number of points that are in the array. Then we play a 2D sound to signify that we've started, and then we call time trial HUD. The time trial HUD, we get a widget and add it to the viewport, and we set the timer widget to be visible. You don't need to do this if you already have a heads-up display in your third-person character. Then we start the timer and signify if it's counting up or counting down. Then we set the time equal to the trial time that we defined when we overlapped with our actor, and then we set a goal to count to. We get the difference and plug that into a timer, and that's how long the time trial starts. When the timer expires, we run reset timer. The reset timer will set the visibility of our timer to hidden, we end running, we default the points back to 0, and we end the trial. When we end the trial, when this reset is called, by default, we do not win the trial. However, if we call reset timer before the timer gets expired, we flag it as a win. So when it reaches here, we can designate that the end trial was a win. Then we clear the timer, we remove the HUD from the parent, we clear and invalidate our timer if this is still running, and we default win back to false. Then for end trial, we go through the trial points and we call time trial reset, which calls the event in our trial points actor. If we've won the game, we play the compile success, and if we fail, we play compile failed. In our trial points actor, at begin play, we deactivate the particle system, so the player can't see it in the game. When we overlap our trial start, this gets overridden, so then it's all set to hidden. And then when we overlap with it, and the particle system is active, we deactivate it. We add however many points we wanted to define here. And I also added a 2D sound, so it has a trigger when we overlap with it. Then when we reset the trial, it's just deactivating the particle system. When we overlap with this, it sends this time trial count information to our third-person character, which we then send back to the trial start actor. If we have anything that's in our character sheet, we can influence this. If you have a multiplier that you want to add on to the points, or if there's anything else you want to send back to the trial start actor, you could do so through calling the time trial count and sends it back to our trial start. When the points are received, it adds it to the current points that are already held in the trial actor. And then when we get a point, we check to see if we've reached the total points, and if we have, we flag a win, and then we call the reset timer. And if this is already running while we overlap with the trial start actor again, we flag the win as false, and we reset the timer because the player has ended the game prematurely. For our timer widget, we have 5 functions. Our start timer dictates whether or not we're going to be counting up. Starts this timer running off the update timer. In update timer, we add the milliseconds and seconds to our current time and output that as a variable in set time. In set time, we break the time span and convert the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds into text to go into our time counter widget text box. We set a goal for ourselves. When we manually set the goal in the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, we compare it to the start time that we put into our trial start actor. And then we take the difference and we get its absolute value, so then the timer is always a positive time. Then we also have a clear timer event that we call whenever we end the timer. So that's the time trial. You should be able to expand on this in other ways, so don't feel constrained to what we've done here. Instead of points that need to be overlapped, it could be enemies that need to be defeated or objects that need to be broken. Maybe you don't want to bother with the timer at all, and you just need the player to reach every point in order to open a door or finish the level. So let me know if you liked the video. You can subscribe here or join the Patreon if you want to follow for more. Free members can suggest a topic for me to make a tutorial on. Paid members get access to all the work I've made so far as blueprint components to add to their own project. And if you've watched this far, I want you to know I think you're great, and I hope you've been inspired.